closer look at how the civil rights movement shifted from a philosophy of strict nonviolence to one of militant self-defense and economic self-determination, and how the government systematically dismantled these efforts with a concerted program of infiltration, psychological warfare, legal harassment, illegal force, and a widespread undermining of public opinion.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
In 1963, when Martin Luther King Jr. outlined in his famous speech his dream for the future, the civil rights movement was nearly a decade old, but it would still be another year before President Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act, and yet another until he signed the Voters' Rights Act. Central High School had been integrated under the supervision of the National Guard more than 5 years earlier, and since then, America was being shown violent reactions to nonviolent protests nightly on the evening news. At the same time, Martin Luther King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was fighting for a place at the table in the rural South, Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam was taking the cities in the North by storm and insisting that the black community should strike out on its own. Denouncing nonviolence, Malcolm X supported the more militant stance that anyone faced with violence has the right to defend themselves by any means necessary. He advocated self-sufficiency and economic independence for African Americans. As a member of the Nation of Islam, Malcolm X supported black nationalism and became a harsh critic of King's methods. But once he split with that organization and journeyed to Mecca to experience the true nature of the Islamic faith, he had a change of strategy and took a softer approach to working with other civil rights leaders, though his stance on self-defense never waned. By 1964, COFO, the Council of Federated Organizations, made up of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, the NAACP, and the aforementioned SCLC, became focused on voter registration in Mississippi. It established that year the Freedom Summer Project, aimed at getting as many black voters registered in that state as possible. That summer's violence against the volunteers and those locals who supported them garnered even more national attention to the movement. Over the next 2 years, the assassination of Malcolm X, the beatings of the marchers from Selma to Montgomery, and the shooting of James Meredith during his March Against Fear led to many of the younger activists to turn away from Dr. King's edict of nonviolence and to adopt a more militant approach to demanding equality. This was evidenced in the Watts riots of 1965 that resulted from yet another heavy-handed police response to an alleged drunk driving incident. A number of new organizations were established at this time to support the black community's efforts at self-sufficiency and militant self-defense. The Nation of Islam, while not a new organization, certainly fit into this category of those who took a more militant and separatist stance. Groups like the African People's Socialist Party, the Malcolm X Grassroots Movement, the US Organization, the Deacons for Defense and Justice, even SNCC and CORE began to follow a more militant philosophy towards the civil rights struggle. The most prominent organization to emerge at this time was the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Created initially to deal with the problem of police brutality in Oakland, the Black Panther Party began when its two founding members, Bobby Seale and Huey Newton, developed what they deemed the 10-point program and platform. It didn't take long for membership to swell and chapters to open all over the country. All of this was fueled by several events that propelled the local Oakland movement into the national spotlight. The first was what the press called the invasion of the California Capitol. After the Panthers began armed patrols of police stops, which were conducted in an entirely legal manner, the California legislature decided to introduce a bill banning the open carry of loaded firearms on public property. In an effort to oppose the passing of the Mulford Act, as it was called, approximately 24 armed Panthers went to Sacramento in May of 1967, and several of them accidentally ended up on the floor of the Assembly chamber. The group, including the founder Bobby Seale, was immediately arrested and their guns confiscated. The second event nearly killed the other founder of the party, Huey Newton. During a late-night patrol, Newton and Gene McKinney were pulled over by Oakland police officer John Fry. After Fry called for backup, a scuffle ensued, and both Newton and Fry were shot. Fry was killed, and Newton was arrested and faced the death penalty. This kicked off a nationwide campaign that blew through college campuses across the country. The campaign to free Huey was ultimately successful when his conviction was overturned and he was released from jail. The third event that brought the Black Panther Party and their version of the Black Power movement into the national spotlight was the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. and subsequently Little Bobby Hutton. Bobby Hutton was the first member to sign up for the Black Panther Party and became treasurer at the tender age of 16. In April of 1968, Martin Luther King's life was taken by bullets fired in hatred by James Earl Ray. The nation's black communities took to the streets. Anger, like the smoke from set fires, filled the air in Oakland, and Eldridge Cleaver, who had recently taken control of the party in light of the founders' arrests, hatched a plan to ambush police and begin the revolution. He could only get a small number of Panthers to agree to go along. Bobby Hutton was one of them. The plan quickly went awry, and Cleaver and Hutton found themselves surrounded by police as they hid in a basement, which was ultimately set ablaze to get them out. As the two emerged, unarmed, hands raised, and naked, Cleaver completely and Hutton to the waist, police opened fire, and Bobby Hutton, 17, was killed. Those sympathetic to the Black Power movement saw this as just another act of police brutality, regardless of the fact that Cleaver admitted to the ambush and several police officers were injured. Cleaver was arrested that night, but was released on bail, at which time he fled to Cuba, and then ultimately to Algeria. With the male leaders of the organization either in jail or in exile, the women of the movement continued the fight for self-sufficiency within the black community. It was at this point that the movement shifted from a staunch militancy, maintaining the advocacy for self-defense by any means necessary, to community building and support. What they deemed survival programs like the free breakfast program, the sickle cell health clinic, the prisoner visit carpools, and neighborhood policing became the focus of these organizations, particularly the Black Panther Party. All of this was funded by local business donations and the selling of the Black Panther paper. As these programs became incredibly popular, the organization began to garner the attention of federal law enforcement. There had been some fear among local policing agencies when the black community began arming itself, but by passing legislation like the Mulford Act, they felt like they could contain that level of extremism. This, however, was going too far. Feeding the hungry, giving comfort to the ill, encouraging black pride, and supporting community political action was a means of uniting the black community, and thus seen as a threat to the existing social order. It was at this time that the FBI, on orders of J. Edgar Hoover, began an active campaign to discredit what he deemed as the largest single threat to domestic security, the establishment of a, quote, black messiah. To this end, they teamed up with local law enforcement in cities like New York, L.A., Chicago, Atlanta, Baltimore, and others with large black populations to, quote, expose, disrupt, misdirect, and otherwise neutralize groups that the FBI officials believed were subversive. In the 60s, those groups were nearly all related to the civil rights movement. The program, labeled COINTELPRO, or Counterintelligence Program, was established in the late 50s to combat the threat of communism, but was easily adapted to combat the threat of racial upheaval via black demand for equal rights under the law. Some of the more insidious tactics used were letter-writing campaigns. There were forged letters sent between members of differing organizations outlining complaints and making threats. These letters became so pervasive that it led to a number of physical altercations, one of which was an armed conflict between the US organization and the Black Panthers, resulting in the death of John Huggins and Alprentice Bunchy Carter of the LA chapter of the Panthers. Not all conflict was caused by the government actions. However, agents were always there to take advantage of any and all opportunities that came their way. Tension between Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver was seized upon and encouraged by police place informants posing as members of the party, to the point that each saw himself as the true leader of the party and expelled the other from membership. The culmination of this kind of chaos is that the Black Panther Party and the other organizations on a national level were in shambles, but in many areas the movement continued to thrive. While Huey Newton and Eldridge Cleaver fought for control of the Black Panther Party and of the Black Power movement itself, a new voice emerged, repeating one powerful phrase.
I am a revolutionary.
Fred Hampton, at the age of 21, rose into the Black Panther Chicago chapter leadership by understanding and emphasizing that the way to overcome the oppression of the rich over the poor was for the poor to coalesce and take back their power. By recruiting from the youth gang structures across the country, Fred Hampton began what would ultimately become the Rainbow Coalition. This kind of solidarity among the poor of all races was one of the basic tenets of socialism, and Fred Hampton, and the Black Panthers in general, advocated the dismantling of capitalism in America, positing that it was that economic system that created the oppression that kept people of all races poor. COINTELPRO then set its sights on Chicago and Fred Hampton. In the early morning hours of December 4, 1969, Chicago police, acting in accordance with the FBI and aided by an informant acting as Hampton's bodyguard, conducted a bullet-riddled raid on the communal home shared by Hampton, his wife, and a number of other party members. It was determined in the investigation of this raid that of the nearly 100 bullets fired that morning, only one was fired by a Panther Party member when his firearm accidentally discharged when dropped. When the smoke from the gunfire cleared, Fred Hampton and Mark Clark were dead. The culmination of all the chaos, this and all the previous assassinations, the arrest and trial of the Chicago 8, the Panther 21 in New York, the police raid on LA headquarters office, and hundreds of other arrests resulted in the ultimate decline of not only the Black Panther Party, but of the entire Black Power movement itself. The more militant groups that survived a bit longer went underground. Groups like the Black Liberation Army and the Weather Underground took on a more offensive stance to proving their point. These kinds of groups conducted a number of domestic terror attacks on government, financial, and legal institutions around the country. This activity continued into the early 1980s, by which time most of the members had either been arrested, killed, or living abroad in exile. As the movement sputtered and kicked out its dying breaths, an FBI informant was tasked with introducing Huey Newton to cocaine, and by the 1980s, he had become a full-blown addict and began shaking down the local Oakland dealers in the name of a long-defunct Black Panther Party. By that time, black communities all over the country were in the grip of another government-sponsored epidemic, crack cocaine. A dealer by the name of Tyrone Robinson confessed to killing Newton in a drug deal gone wrong, but there are some that believe that Robinson was simply another tool of the government. There is no evidence that this was the case. Today, Black, Indigenous, and other people of color are still fighting against police brutality and systemic racism. This nation has come a long way, but still has a long way to go.